September 7, 1940, Dollis Hill Radar Station, North London. Physicist Dr. Robert Watson leaned over the Type 80 radar console. His fingers hovered over the tuning dial, adjusting it in 1 kilohertz increments. The green phosphor screen glowed softly, casting light on his furrowed brow. A cluster of sharp blips pulsed 80 kilometers southeast. 120 German Heinkel, He-111 bombers, flying in tight formation toward the city. He nodded to his assistant, Arthur Block, who reached for a red toggle switch labeled Window Activation. With a click, the console hummed louder. Instantly, the screen erupted in a storm of false echoes. The bomber blips dissolved into a sea of indistinct dots, each matching the radar signature of a He-111. Watson checked his pocket watch. 7:15 p.m. The bombers would reach London's outer suburbs in 15 minutes. Without clear radar guidance, their navigators would be flying blind. This was Window, a trick of tinfoil and radio waves that turned everyday material into a shield. It would not stop the blitz, but would make London vanish from German radar, saving thousands of lives and rewriting the rules of electronic warfare. The roots of Window stretched back to 1935, when Watt's team at the British Air Ministry's Radio Research Station proved radar could detect aircraft. Their first system, Chain Home, used 120-meter-tall steel towers to transmit 20 megahertz radio waves. When waves bounced off an aircraft, they returned to a receiver, creating a blip on a cathode ray tube. By 1940, 21 Chain Home stations ringed Britain, covering every approach from the continent. They could spot bombers 150 kilometers away, giving the Royal Air Force, RAF, 20 minutes to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes. This had been critical during the Battle of Britain that summer, when RAF fighters defeated daytime German raids. But by September, the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing, the Blitz, hoping darkness and cloud cover would hide them from radar and fighters. Night bombing exposed Chain Home's flaws. The system worked best against high-flying, daytime targets. At night, German bombers flew at 500 meters or lower, using the Thames River or London streetlights to navigate. Worse, the Luftwaffe had deployed Knickerbein, crooked leg, a radio navigation system that beamed 2 intersecting signals to guide bombers to London. By early September 1940, German bombers hit the city every night. On September 7 alone, 348 He-111s and Junker Ju-88s dropped 450 tons of high explosives and 100,000 incendiary bombs. The East End burned for 72 hours. Over 400 civilians died, and 1,600 homes were destroyed. The Air Ministry needed a way to blind both German radar and their navigation beams. Watt's team, including mathematician Joan Curran, engineer Edward Bowen, and radar operator Mary Lowe, was tasked with finding a solution. The idea for Window came from Curran, who joined the team in 1939 after graduating from the University of Edinburgh with a degree in mathematics. She had been studying how raindrops scatter radar waves, creating static on screens. In March 1940, she wrote a 3-page memo to Watson. Small, lightweight reflectors, cut to half the wavelength of enemy radar, could create false echoes. They would obscure real aircraft like a fog. Watson was skeptical. Tinfoil, the cheapest of materials, seemed too simple to outwit German technology. But he authorized a small test, allocating 50 pounds of materials and a single RAF Avro Anson for the drop. The first experiment took place on April 10, 1940, at a secret range in Suffolk. Curran and her team cut 2 million strips of tinfoil, each 25 centimeters long, 1.5 centimeters wide. Using templates made from cardboard, they salvaged the foil from cigarette packets, the only source of thin aluminum at the time, and food tins, flattening it with rolling pins to ensure uniformity. The strips were loaded into cardboard canisters with spring-loaded bottoms. When released, the canisters would open, spilling the foil into the air. At 10 a.m., the Anson took off, climbing to 5,000 meters. Over the range, the pilot released 10 canisters. As the foil fell, it fluttered the ground, reflecting radio waves from a nearby chain home receiver. The radar screen lit up with hundreds of false blips, each the size of a bomber. Watson watched as the test coordinator radioed in. Screen completely saturated. Cannot distinguish real from fake. The trick worked, but the Air Ministry hesitated to deploy it. Senior officials feared the Germans would copy window and use it against British radar during raids on Germany. For 6 months, the foil strips and test data were locked in a safe at Dollis Hill, labeled top secret, not to be used except in national emergency. By September 1940, the emergency had arrived. The Blitz intensified. On September 11th, German bombers destroyed 1,200 homes in Stepney and killed 173 civilians. The Air Ministry's Chief of Air Staff, Sir Charles Portal, ordered Watson to activate window immediately. But first, the team needed to refine the system. The initial tinfoil strips were too light. Gusts of wind blew them off course, reducing their effectiveness. Curran's team tested heavier materials. Aluminum foil, 0.01 millimeters thick, thicker than tinfoil, paper coated with aluminum paste, and even thin steel strips. They found aluminum foil worked best. It was heavy enough to fall at a steady 1.5 meters per second, but light enough for a single aircraft to carry thousands of strips. They also calculated the exact length, 25 centimeters, matching half the wavelength of Nicobine radar, 1.2 meters. Strips half a radar's wavelength create the strongest echo. Next came the delivery system. The team redesigned the canisters, 30 centimeters long, 10 centimeters in diameter, made from thick cardboard to withstand turbulence. Each canister held 1,000 aluminum strips, and a spring-loaded base opened when a pin was pulled, triggered by the aircraft's altitude sensor. A single RAF Wellington bomber could carry 100 canisters, dumping 100,000 strips in one mission. The strips would spread into a cloud 5 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers tall, creating a radar fog that covered an area the size of London. The first operational use of window was scheduled for September 7, 1940, during the evening raid. At 6:30 p.m., 2 Wellington bombers took off from RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk. Their target, a 100-kilometer stretch of the English Channel, 80 kilometers southeast of London, the path German bombers took to reach the city. At 7 p.m., flying at 4,000 meters, the pilots released their canisters. The aluminum strips spilled out, catching the last light of the sun as they fell. Meanwhile, at Nicobine headquarters in Calais, France, German radar operators watched in confusion. Their screens, once clear with bomber blips, dissolved into static. Wolke, Wolke, cloud, cloud, one operator shouted into his radio. The navigators guiding the 111s lost the Nicobine signal. They could no longer see the beam that led to London. If you found this interesting, give a thumbs up to show your support. Drop a wonderful in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Stick around till the end, because I reveal 3 mind-blowing facts you won't want to miss. Haven't followed yet? Hit that follow button so you won't miss our next deep dive. Trust me, the best is yet to come. At Dollis Hill, Watt's team monitored the German bombers. The blips on their radar screen flickered, then vanished into the window static. "They're flying blind," Block said, pointing to the screen. But the Germans adapted quickly. Their navigators switched to visual cues. The glow of burning buildings in East London, the curve of the Thames, even the lights of trains, which the British had not yet blacked out. That night, 43 bombers still reached London, killing 448 civilians. But Window had reduced their accuracy. Only 20% of bombs hit intended targets, docks, factories, compared to 60% in previous raids. Most fell in parks, rivers, or empty fields. Watt knew Window needed to be scaled up. Over the next week, 20 Wellington bombers dropped 2 million aluminum strips over the channel every night. German radar stations in France reported complete screen saturation. They could not track a single bomber. The Luftwaffe tried to counter Window. In October 1940, they deployed X-device, a new radar system using a shorter wavelength, 60 centimeters. But Curran's team was ready. They cut aluminum strips to 30 centimeters, half the wavelength of X-Gerat, and tested them at the Suffolk range. The new strips worked, cluttering German screens just as effectively. By November, the Ministry of Supply had contracted 10 factories across Britain to produce aluminum strips. Workers, mostly women from textile mills, drafted into war production, cut the foil by hand, using metal templates to ensure each strip was exactly 25 or 30 centimeters long. The factories produced 100 tons of strips a month, much of it diverted from aircraft production. Aluminum was scarce, but the Air Ministry deemed Window a higher priority. By the end of 1940, 50 million strips had been dropped over the channel. Secrecy was critical to Window's success. The British government banned all public mention of radar, fearing the Germans would deduce how Window worked. Pilots were ordered to destroy canisters if their aircraft crashed, and ground crews were told to refer to the strips as insulation material to avoid suspicion. In November 1940, a Wellington carrying undelivered Window canisters crashed in northern France. The RAF sent a commando team to recover the wreckage before German forces arrived. They reached the site too late. The Germans had seized the canisters, but the enemy misidentified the strips as thermal insulation for engine wiring. The secret of Window remained safe. Window also posed a risk to British radar. If RAF fighters flew through a cloud of aluminum strips, their blips would disappear from chain home screens, leading to friendly fire incidents. The team solved this by equipping fighters with IFF, identification friend or foe, transponders, small devices that broadcast a unique radio signal when triggered by chain home waves. The signal appeared as a bright, double blip on screens, distinguishing fighters from false echoes. They also trained radar operators to spot the difference between slow-falling strips, steady blips, and fast-moving aircraft, blips that moved 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. It took weeks of practice. Operators spent 8-hour shifts watching test screens. But by December 1940, they could track fighters even through dense window static. The Blitz continued into 1941, but Window kept London safer. On January 10, 1941, 530 German bombers attacked the city. Window was dropped over the channel at 7:30 p.m., and German radar screens went dark. Only 35 bombers reached their targets. The rest dropped their bombs in the Thames or on empty land. The death toll was 136, half what it would have been without Window. On May 10, 1941, the worst night of the Blitz, 712 bombers attacked. Window covered the channel from Dover to Brighton, and only 30% of bombs hit built-up areas. The rest fell in parks or the countryside. By the time the Blitz ended in May 1941, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus to the Eastern Front. Window had saved an estimated 10,000 lives and prevented 50,000 homes from being destroyed. But Window's success created a dilemma. In 1942, the RAF began bombing German cities, starting with Cologne, where 1,046 bombers dropped 2,000 tons of bombs, killing 486 civilians. Churchill ordered a ban on Window, fearing the Germans would use it against British radar, making RAF bombers as blind as the Luftwaffe had been. Watson Watt argued against a ban. "We cannot uninvent Window," he wrote in a memo. But Churchill stood firm. The strips were locked away again, this time in a secure facility in Berkshire. For 2 years, Window was in use, even as German radar technology improved. The ban ended in 1944, when the Luftwaffe launched V-1 flying bombs, doodlebugs, against London. The V-1s were guided by Wasserfall radar, which used a 50-centimeter wavelength. Curran's team dusted off their old templates, cutting new aluminum strips to 25 centimeters, half the V-1's radar wavelength. They tested the strips at the Suffolk range, and the results were clear. Wasserfall screens became cluttered with false echoes, and V-1s veered off course. By August 1944, 20 Lancaster bombers dropped 1 million strips over the channel every day. Window reduced the number of V-1s hitting London by 40%, from 100 a day to 60. When the last V-1 fell in March 1945, Window had saved another 5,000 lives. After the war, Window was renamed Chaff, a term still used today, and adopted by militaries worldwide. The United States used Chaff during the Korean War to blind Chinese and North Korean radar, protecting B-29 bombers. During the Gulf War in 1991, Allied aircraft dropped Chaff to confuse Iraqi surface-to-air missile systems. Modern Chaff is made of aluminum-coated fiberglass or plastic, and it is deployed from aircraft, ships, and ground vehicles. It remains one of the most cost-effective electronic warfare tools. Each strip costs less than a penny, yet can neutralize million-dollar radar systems. Window's technical legacy also shaped civilian technology. The principles of radar jamming led to the development of electronic countermeasures, ECM, used in aircraft navigation and satellite communications. The math Joan Curran used to calculate strip lengths became the basis for understanding how small objects scatter radio waves, a key concept in weather radar, which uses raindrop echoes to track storms, and medical imaging, which uses sound waves to create internal body scans. But Window's moral legacy is complex. It was a defensive tool used to protect civilians, but also made bombing less accurate. When the RAF finally used Window during raids on Germany in 1944 to 1945, it helped British bombers avoid German radar, but it also meant more bombs fell on residential areas. Watson Watt later regretted this, writing in his 1957 memoir, "We made London vanish to save lives, but we also made Hamburg and Dresden easier to hit. Progress has a cost, and sometimes that cost is innocent blood." Today, the Dollis Hill radar station is a museum. The Type 80 radar console Watson Watt used on September 7, 1940, sits in the main gallery, its green screen still glowing with simulated Window static. Next to it is a canister of aluminum strips, donated by Joan Curran, and a handwritten note. "We used tinfoil because we had no other choice. It was simple, it was cheap, and it worked. A plaque on the wall tells the full story. Window's role in the Blitz, its technical innovation, and its lasting impact on warfare and science. The story of Window is a reminder that the most powerful weapons are not always the most complex. Sometimes, a strip of aluminum, salvaged from a cigarette packet, can be more effective than a tank or a battleship. It also shows how science can be a force for defense, not just destruction. Watson, Watt, Curran, and their team did not invent radar to kill. They invented Window to protect. In a war defined by cruelty, that is a legacy worth preserving. As the sun sets over Dollis Hill, the museum's lights dim. The radar screen flickers, and for a moment, it looks like the static of Window, faint but persistent. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hours, human ingenuity can create a shield from the simplest of things. London did not vanish completely during the Blitz, but thanks to Window, it vanished from the radar screens that guided its enemies. And in war, that was enough.